know, particularly Well, good evening, everybody. This is the meeting taking place on the 11th of January 2023 of the East Arts District Council Development Management Committee. Just before I go to the agenda, I'm just going to say a very warm welcome to all members of the public who are here this evening. I appreciate that, no doubt, maybe at least some of you, if not all of you, are concerned, but it's still very nice to have you here, and it's great to see the level of engagement. So thank you all very much for coming. If, just in case people arrive late, so I don't have to keep interrupting the meeting, perhaps the people closest to the door could let late arrivals know that there is a room downstairs and they can sit there if they wish to, and it's all sort of telecast or something like that. So that's okay. Yes, and perhaps the other thing I should just do before we start on the formal agenda is just do my duty in terms of safety announcements. So first of all, there are no fire alarms or safety alarms scheduled. So if one does go off, it's for real. And there are two exits from this room. One is through those doors over there, which are the doors I guess 90% of you came in through. But you can exit the building also through these doors here. Touch wood, it's a highly unlikely eventuality, but that's the way you would leave this room. Okay, now moving on to the agenda proper. Item 1 is apologies. We have only one apology, and that's from Councillor Carolyn Redfern, and she's substituted for this evening by Councillor Mary Brady. Thank you very much, Mary. Item 2 is Chairman's announcements. I have no Chairman's announcements. Thank you. Items 3, declarations of interest. And I think Councillor Newton just wishes to declare something which doesn't quite amount to an interest, but even so, you'd like people to know, wouldn't you, Sally?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's just a bit of business, but whilst it does not relate to this application this evening, I wanted to mention the following for the purposes of transparency and openness. My family owned land north of Ware Park Farm, which was subject to a screening request in relation to solar farm development by an independent neighbouring company on the 25th of November 2022. I understand that no full application has been submitted by this company yet, and I just wanted to put it on record that this has no bearing on my ability to determine the application before us tonight, and I come with an open mind. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Newton. Item 4 is minutes. This is the minutes of the meeting of the 7th of December. They've all been circulated via the website. So any comments, members? In which case, can I have a proposer and a seconder, please? Councillor Ruffles and Councillor Page. All those in favour, please show your hand. Thank you. I think there's an abstention because you weren't present, were you, Terence? That's fine. Okay, thank you. So move on to item 5 now, which is planning applications. We have one matter this evening, which is application 321-2601 FUL. This relates to the erection of a solar photovoltaic farm with an output capacity not to exceed 49.9 megawatts of energy, with supporting infrastructure and battery storage, inverters and transformers, fencing and landscaping works at Wickham Hall Estate, Haddon Road, Bishop Stortford. And I'm going to ask the case officer, please, to introduce this. So that's you, Richard, isn't it? Yes, Richard Freeman, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Good evening to members of the committee and good evening to members of the public. My name is Richard Freeman, I'm a team leader in the Development Management Service here at East Herts, and I'm the presenting officer for this application tonight. What I'm going to do, with your permission, Chair, is just take members briefly through a summary of the scheme itself and the site, and then I will talk to some of the main material planning considerations, and obviously more than willing to answer any questions which there may be. The application, as you are aware, is for the erection of a solar photovoltaic farm. The main elements of the proposal in terms of site area are the solar panels themselves, but there are various other pieces of kit and equipment necessary to make that work in the form of various inverters, transformers, battery storage cells, associated infrastructure with that, especially around the cooling of those units. The scheme also includes a significant amount of landscaping works, which I'll talk you through as well. It's located on part of the Wickham Hall estate, which is near St Little Haddam. It's located on the north side of the new bypass pass assessment. Next slide, please. Thank you. This shows you the location plan for the site. So the area which would be the solar farm, if it were to be approved and implemented, is outlined in red at the top of that plan, and at the bottom in blue is other land in the applicant's ownership associated with the development. And so this is really to make clear that the solar panels and all the associated infrastructure works, apart from the temporary site access, would be the area located in red there. And if we could have the next slide, please. This is a previous version of the site plan, and this is an amended proposal. When it was originally submitted, it was part of a larger proposal which spanned both parts of East Herts District Council and parts of Uttlesford. So the local authority boundary, I hope you can see, is the black dotted line which runs north-south and then moves east. The area in bluey purple is in East Herts, and the area in yellow is in Uttlesford. The other thing which this plan is showing is areas of green belts. So where there is a hatched line across it, that's designated green belts, and the other areas are not designated green belts. They, within East Herts, fall within our rural area beyond the green belt designation, which GBR2 in the East Herts District Plan talks to. This was the original proposal. The scheme has then been amended and reduced. Uttlesford refused planning permission for the part and their sites. There are a number of reasons for refusal, and I can go into it in more detail if members wish. But the principal issue was the impact on the green belts and potential impact on archaeology and various other issues around the information which had been submitted. The assessments of proposals in the green belts and assessment of proposals in the rural area beyond the green belts are different. Policy GBR1 in the local plan and the MPPF provides policies and guidance around how greenbelt proposals should be assessed, and in the rural area beyond the greenbelt, it doesn't have that protection. It has the protections afforded in GBR2, which lists a series of types of development which are acceptable in rural areas where they maintain the character and appearance of the greenbelt. So sorry if that's slightly long-winded. The point is it was larger, is now smaller. As a result of removing the southern section of the proposal, and the Uttlesford scheme not coming forward because it was refused, what's within the East Herts portion has been amended so that it's a smaller area, and the associated infrastructure, the various transformers, substations, etc., are now located in the part currently under consideration when they were previously in the Uttlesford part of the proposal. Next slide, thank you. This is a slightly more zoomed in site plan. You can, and I'm going to point out a couple of features which I'll come on to later as well in the presentation. This, because of the nature of the relatively large site, it doesn't necessarily reproduce very well on the screen, but effectively the horizontal black lines are the proposed solar panels. You can see the site outline in red. The areas within the site is effectively the existing field boundaries, which form some existing hedges, existing fences, and some tracks. All of those existing hedges would be maintained, would be retained, sorry, they would still be kept, and in fact they would be upgraded. And the same with the tracks as well. Before I get into describing some of the elements in detail, just to maybe help orientate members, the arching black line in the bottom left, in the southwest of the slide, is the new bypass, and the double black lines, which you can see moving north-south, are some pylons which run to the east of the site and are pretty easily visible. Beyond that, you've got two large areas of dark green, which are existing woodlands, which lie beyond the site boundary, and the proposal wouldn't have any significant impact on them. I think maybe just the other thing which I'm going to point out is that there is an L-shaped barn building, which I'll point to in a moment on the site plan, which you'll see in some of the photographs as well, and which is a relatively prominent local feature, I think it's fair to say. Moving on to some of the existing soft landscaping, you can see the effective field pattern. It is an irregular series of fields, pretty typical of what you find in a rural area. Series of hedges subdividing the fields, some woodland blocks, some lone trees as well, and then some buildings primarily associated with Little Haddam and the old main road, and then moving into Bishop Stortford. So Bishop Stortford is just off that drawing to the east by about 300, 500 meters or so. I'm now just going to talk through a couple of elements of what's on the site itself in a bit more detail, and so I'll have to get up and point at the screen a couple of times if that's all right. So I've already talked about the horizontal black lines, which are the solar panels. They'd be arranged in panels which would be angled to point towards south, and as you can see, they have irregular edges on the outside, so that if you are in a position where you can actually see them from a distance en masse, which there aren't any positions where you can see that easily, that will go some way towards helping break down its impact on the area in terms of having an irregular outline. The next thing I'll point out is the existing hedgerows. So I'll get up and point to those in a moment. Well, I'll point to those now. So all of those would be retained, and then each of the and in fact would be enhanced, and there'd be over 2 kilometres of additional hedgerow planting. You'll see that the very northern end of the plan, within the red line boundary, there is an area which is shown on this as white space. That's a proposed woodland block. I'll show you that in more detail on another drawing. And then each of the fields effectively contain the solar panels, and then they also have inverters in them. So solar panels generate electricity at a direct current. In order for it to be usable by the grid, it needs to be converted into alternating currents, and that happens in each of the fields. So in each of the fields, there are a number of those inverters, and I'll show you a side of what those look like in a moment, but I'll just point some of them out. Thank you. And then the other thing which I'd like to point out is on the eastern boundary of the site, you can see picked out in orange is an area where most of the infrastructure would be. So in that location, there would be transformers, which converts the electricity to a voltage which is usable by the local grid. There would be effectively shipping containers, which would include battery packs within them, so that at times when the solar farm is generating, but is not exporting to the grid, those batteries are being charged. There would be a storage container, and there'd be various other bits of infrastructure associated with it. That's all located in that area there, effectively. Next slide, please. This is the proposed landscaping strategy. And so this is the document which officers have recommended is approved. And what it does is show you the primarily soft landscaping, which is associated with the proposal. So I pointed out previously the existing hedgerows, which is the dark colour on the site plan. And then there are also proposed hedgerows as well. So effectively, those are the lighter colour, and they go round all of the field boundaries, it's fair to say, and also run along the edge of the bypass as well. The other thing to point out, as you can see at A and C especially, those are either newly proposed woodland planting blocks or are existing planting blocks which get reinforced, existing woodland areas which get reinforced, and there are approximately 10,000 trees being proposed to be planted as part of this proposal. So I will stand up and point to it in a moment, but effectively what we've got is at the very northern end, we've got a new woodland planting area, and then we've got two sections of enhanced woodland planting, and then reinforced or enlarged hedges around the fields. You can also see on the bottom of the image examples of what is being proposed to be planted. So that gives you an idea of the species which would be proposed as well. At this point, can I draw members' attention to the addendum? So there's a summary of late representations. And one of the things which that does, apart from summarize the representations received, we are proposing the addition of a new condition. Sorry, no, we're proposing the rewording of one of the bullets in condition 7 of the landscaping and ecological management plan, just to get full details of the proposed planting. So we're happy with what we're very happy with the locations of the planting proposed and the amount of it. We're happy with the species which are being suggested, but the final details of the exact species, the density of them, how near they're planted together, what the maintenance strategy is, etc. We need slightly more details, and so that condition is proposed to be reworded slightly. I think the final point which I'd like to point out on this is that the proposal also includes wildflower planting. So underneath the panels themselves are on frames or mounts, they're lifted off the ground. Underneath that is proposed to be planted with a grassland planting mix. And then around it, the yellow colours, the periphery of the solar farm fields, would be planted with a new wildflower seeding mix, and so that would provide additional wildflower for pollinators and other species. Probably worth saying at this point, so the scheme is recommended for approval, Chair, with as a temporary permission requiring it to be removed after the lifespan of the solar panels. The report sets out in detail the balance in planning terms and why we think that's the recommendation which we're making to you. But in summary, in very brief summary, it's because the negative elements of it, which are the fact that whilst this is here, this can't be used for agricultural land for production of food, and some disbenefits in terms of those fields not being available for wildlife or wild creatures, at least during the lifetime of the development, are temporary. Once this is removed, that goes away, it can be used again. The land, the soil will be the same quality as it is at the moment, at least. Whereas, so those negatives are temporary. Some of the positives are temporary as well, the generation of solar electricity, but the biodiversity improvements, or at least some of those, are permanent. So the woodland blocks to the north, the improvements to the hedgerows, and the yellow areas of wildflower seeding is proposed that those are retained after the lifetime of the development. So in coming to that balancing act, it's important from officers' perspective that some of those negatives are temporary and some of the positives are permanent. Next slide, please. Some images of the proposed equipment itself. So this is a side-on view of the solar panels themselves. So angle to face south, 25 degrees. They are on frames with a maximum height of just under 3 meters, 2.9 meters. And as you can see, they go into the ground in kind of with stakes. They aren't on hard standing. It's not as if the entire fields get turned into footings. There's a good gap between them, 5.5 meters or 9 meters, 9.5 meters from the front of one to the front of another. And so, as you'll see, there's some consideration of the drainage issues, and we're satisfied that there's sufficient space between the panels for the water to continue to infiltrate naturally into the ground. Next slide, please. And this is an image of one of the inverters. So this is the piece of equipment which would be located within the fields. So up to 3.5 meters tall and 6 meters wide. It's what converts the current, and it also includes some air conditioning in it as well. So in doing that, it generates some noise and heat, and so there are air conditioning units embedded in them, if I can put it that way, which I'll come on to again in minutes. Next slide, please. And this is just a typical version of one of the storage containers which are located in that central area, which you saw in orange on the site plan. And there's a variety of different containers in that location. This is a typical example of it. It's actually the largest one. So it's 12 meters long by 2.5 wide and up to 3 meters high. These storage containers and the equipment in that location would generally be on hard standing, would be on flagstones, because they carry more weight and more equipment in them. This is the one which has the battery packs within it, but the others, which are the substations, are very similar to this. They're effectively shipping containers, I think it's fair to say. By condition, they'd be coated in a dark green color or similar. Next slide, please. Thank you. So, Chair, that's where I'm going to leave a summary of what the proposal itself is, if I may. And what I'm going to do is spend a couple more minutes talking about the material considerations and the key impacts of the proposal. So that obviously this is set out in your report in detail, but the first one really is about the character of the area, landscape, the impact on the landscape, the impact on agricultural land, and the suitability of the site in those respects. Hopefully members will be able to tell from this aerial photograph from Google Maps where the site is, but just in case. So it's an area of 59 hectares, which is not inconsiderable in many respects, but it is a very small area of the area, which is both rural in character in East Herts and also available for agricultural production in East Herts and in the wider area as well. The purpose of this slide really is because this needs to be assessed in terms of its impact on the landscape. It needs to be assessed in terms of its visual impact as well, in terms of how you look at it, but more widely, you've got to think about the impact on the landscape. And the landscape is set out in the borough character appraisal, which defines different areas of landscape with different characteristics. And what this is effectively is an area of relatively typical rural landscape, where there are field boundaries generally of hedges, dispersed woodland blocks, and some urban or man-made form. And really what you get from this slide is it's not very far away from Bishop Stortford. There are other settlements in the broad area, and actually it is in many ways dominated by the bypass around Little Haddam and by Bishop Stortford, and also the pylons which run north-south to the east of the site as well. So those urban interjections into the landscape are existing characteristics of the landscape. This isn't an area which is untouched by development, if I can put it that way, and that forms part of the characteristic. Next slide, please. And then just zooming in a bit more, there are a number of other roads and a number of farm tracks and buildings such as the barn, which you can see there as well, which also form part of that local character. So what you see as you move through the site on some of the public rights of way, or where if you manage to see the site from the bypass or at long distance, would change. The visual appearance of that area would change. As I'll show you in a moment, it would be screened by hedging after that's been established, but that is still a change. But the overall landscape character of the area, officers consider, wouldn't be changed so significantly as to be unacceptable. It's an area which already has some man-made interventions in it. The existing field pattern and the existing field boundaries would be retained, so we're not having a monolithic block which can't be accessed. The screening, the mitigation of that landscape impacts is naturalistic through planting of hedges and woodlands, and those are things which you typically find in the area. So if you look at it at a landscape level and a landscape scale, there would be some impacts, but taken at that scale, officers consider that it would be it would be minimal and it would be acceptable. Next slide, please. There'd been some representations made about rights of way, and also this is an important element of the proposal, and so something which members need to be aware of. Some concerns being raised about the loss of access to parts of the countryside and loss of access to footpaths. There would be no footpaths lost as a result of this proposal, and there'd be 2 kilometres of additional publicly accessible footpaths. The green shows the existing, and the blue shows the proposed. So in terms of the existing, it's probably worth pointing out the Hertfordshire Way, which runs north-south along the western boundary of the site. It's probably fair to say that that would be the most used footpath in the local area, and we've got some photo montages of what that would look like. And then there's a permissive, there's a footpath which runs to the northern boundary of the site in green, but an existing farm track, which is the blue, which kind of goes in an L shape, is actually already used quite a lot by members of the public, even though it's not a right of way, and that would be proposed as a permissive path. In blue, in the Uttersford area and along the boundary as well, you can see that there is proposed footpaths as well, and that would be secured through this planning permission, even though the developments in that area, the solar panels in that area, have been removed. Next slide, please. Yeah, I just want, so this is a photo montage taken by the applicant as part of the landscape and visual impact assessment, and it's taken from the bypass, and it's looking at the site, and so the solar panels would effectively be in the foreground on the left-hand side. But the point of this is really, this is a relatively typical photograph of the local area. It's very difficult to actually show you some photographs of the whole site itself because there isn't any one vantage point where you can see it all. And that's part of the site selection. It is on slightly high ground, so you can't really look down on it. There's a slight fold in the ground as well, so it's not as if it's all laid out to be visible, and it would be the proposal would be hidden behind the existing hedges. But this is a relatively typical photograph of part of the site, and really the point of this is it is a rural natural landscape, but it does have some man-made interventions in it, which are past that character. Next slide, please. Getting towards the end, hopefully members will be glad to hear. We've got a series of slides which are part of the landscape and visual impact assessment. So when excuse me, when proposing a scheme which would have a significant impact on a landscape or potential to have an impact on a landscape, a landscape and visual impact assessment is submitted, and that's undertaken to a certain methodology, which is an industry standard. And as well as the views which you're going to see, it also includes an analysis of the character of the landscape and its susceptibility to impacts and its ability to absorb those impacts, and all of that goes into selecting a site and assess from our perspective from assessing a site and being confident in it. This is carried out by experts and it's been reviewed by our landscape planners as well. And so I've got a series of photo montages of views which show the proposal, and those are being selected with input from us, from our landscape planners, from the case officer, to make sure that we're happy that they are a fair representation of the proposal. So this is viewpoint 3A, which you won't be able to see, so I'll point to where it's from. So it's from the south of the site, looking north, with the bypass in the foreground. So the top photo is the existing photograph, and then the bottom one is what it would look like if the consent is implemented on day one, effectively. So the white grey line, which you can see is part of the bypass infrastructure, and then you can see the solar panels. The other thing to point out in this slide as well is you can probably just see, hopefully, around the edge of the bypass, there's a fence, a wire fence about 2 meters high. That is a deer-proof fence. That's a similar style of fence to that which is proposed as part of this development. And in the next slide, you will see that after 5 years, so again, the top photograph is the existing, the bottom is proposed, and that's an assessment once those new hedgerows have grown after 5 years, you can see that it starts to be screened. And in the next slide, please, that's after 10 years as well. So this is at a point taken from a public right of way, so a footpath. So this is a view which some people would see, but it's not the view which you'd normally look at. You can see that you're looking at 90 degrees from the public right of way. So you have to be walking down the public right of way, looking at the proposal in order to see this. So hopefully members will agree that that impact is relatively minimal, especially once the landscaping is built up. And also you'd have to be looking relatively hard to see it. Next slide, please. This is a photograph from viewpoint 5, and so I'll point that out again. That's there, looking east. And so this is where you've walked down the Hertfordshire Way, and you're about to turn south to go under the bypass effectively. So the application site is in the fields in front of you, and so that's why on the bottom photograph on day 1 of implementation you see the solar panels there. They're set back from all of the public rights of way, all of the tracks by 5 meters or more in some instances, but they would however be visible. And the next slide, please. This shows it after 5 years, and the next one after 10 years. There is also an image showing it after 15 years where effectively the screening gets even higher. The details of the maintenance of that screening would be secured by that LEMP condition because it is an important part of the acceptability of the proposal. Next slide, please. So that's dealt hopefully with how we've assessed the landscape and the impacts on that and the impacts in terms of visual appearance. Very briefly, I want to touch on agricultural land as well. I talked about it earlier, so I'm not going to add very much to that. This is best and most versatile agricultural land, and government guidance in the MPPF and the PPG talks about that being retained for agricultural use. And that's paragraph 174 of the MPPF. An assessment has been, so all of the sites is best and most versatile agricultural land. The proposal would result in the loss of that for agricultural production for the lifetime of the development. That is in the planning balance, that's something which needs to be factored in. Officers think that that is acceptable because that is temporary, because at the end of the process, once this is removed, the soil would have had an opportunity to recharge. It wouldn't have nitrates leaching into it. And so it would be at least the same soil classification as it is at the moment. That would be skewed by condition. Natural England have assessed the proposals and they're satisfied that they don't object to the proposal, subject to conditions around the decommissioning to make sure that the soil is that category. The other elements that as well is the amount of agricultural land which this takes up. This is set out from paragraphs 8.1 of the report onwards, and effectively this is a very small area. Whilst indeed it does look quite large, it is a very small area in terms of the amount of land available for agricultural production in the district and in the wider area, and so when that is considered against the amount of renewable energy which is generated, officers are satisfied that it's acceptable from that perspective as well. One of the key benefits of the scheme clearly is the fact that it would generate renewable energy. That's enough power effectively to provide electricity to approximately 10,000 average homes. And so that weighs clearly on the positive side of it. I've talked about the biodiversity impacts, so I don't really think that I need to add any more to that. A consideration has been given to heritage as well. There are some heritage assets in terms of listed buildings in the wider area. This is far enough away that it wouldn't have any significant impact on those. It is in an area where some archaeology may be present. A desktop study has been done. The county historic environment unit have assessed that and are happy to not object to the proposal, subject to conditions to require further work to be done. In terms of highways impacts, the scheme would have very little impact. It is the implementation of the scheme which would have some impact, and there would be a temporary access from the southern end of the site leading down to the existing road network. That goes through the Metropolitan Green Belt, and so conditions are recommended to make sure that it is temporary. And one of the items in the addendum is to slightly tweak recommended condition 5 to include further details of the removal of that temporary access, so that once it's been constructed, that's taken away, so there's no greenbelt access. Once it's there, the impact in terms of ongoing maintenance would be limited. It would be maintained, I understand, by the landowner in accordance with submitted decals, and so there wouldn't be very many vehicle movements associated with that. It's not anticipated that the panels themselves would be replaced wholesale in the lifetime of the development, although clearly there would be some maintenance. Drainage and noise and impact on residential amenity are the final points. The nearest residential property is located at the very northern end of that plan. You can hopefully just see the grey outline of a group of buildings, and that's the nearest residential property. We've gone into a lot of detail around the potential noise impacts of it. We've had meetings with our environmental health team and the applicant to make sure that the proposal would not add to the ambient noise level. In fact, the noise generated would be below the ambient noise level so that it wouldn't add to it, and conditions are recommended around securing full details of that, and also a post-construction noise survey to make sure that it is operating in the way that it's meant to. And finally, drainage as well. Conditions are recommended to ensure full details of how the site would be drained can be submitted. In summary, Chair, as set out in the planning balance section of the proposal, this is a proposal which would have some impact on the landscape character. It would have some impact in terms of the temporary loss of best and most versatile land for the lifetime of the development. On the other side of the equation, it would allow the generation of renewable energy. Some of the biodiversity enhancements are permanent, and there are no disbenefits in terms of public access to land, and in fact improvements in that regard. The recommendation, therefore, is for approval. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much indeed, Richard. Just one tiny little point before we move on to other speakers. You've, for obvious reasons, touched on diversity. I don't think you've put up any form of percentage on the extent to, I'm putting this deliberately neutrally, on the extent to which biodiversity will go down or increase. And just since you've touched on, are you able to do that?
I am, Chair, but I actually can't find the right paragraph right now. But there is a significant biodiversity net gain. So the target, the guidance is for a 10% net gain, and it is significantly beyond that. And I imagine that the applicant, when they speak, will speak to it. But maybe I can come in later with the exact figure.
Yeah, sure. I'm sure this will come up.
But so it's very significant. It includes planting of 10,000 trees, 2 kilometres of additional hedgerows, the wildflower planting which I pointed out, as well as the chalk grassland planting that's underneath the panels.
If you could just find it and announce it at some point during the meeting. Thank you very much. Terence, you think, sorry, you were helping Richard there. Where is it, Terence? That's your best. That's any bids above 5.15. Okay, okay.
Sorry, I beg your pardon. I do beg your pardon. Yeah, it's in the comment from Herts and Middlesex Wildlife Trust. So effectively, it's an 82% gain in terms of habitat units. Habitat units are a mixture of different types of habitat, hedgerows, grassland, etc. So we aim for a 10% gain, and there's an 82% gain. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. Okay, we now move on to speakers. We have a speaker against, and we have some speakers for. So these are public speakers. So we're going to start with the speaker against, who is Tim Horner. That's it. Sit in the seat. And I suspect, Mr. Horner, you know this, but repetition is no bad thing. You get 3 minutes. The 3 minutes will start from when you press the button, so don't press it until you're absolutely ready. But if you are still speaking at 3 minutes, we will cut you off. So it's 3 minutes. Okay, over to you. Thank you.
I'm Tim Horner, speaking on behalf of the residents against Wycombe Solar. I'm absolutely amazed that the planning officer in his comments just now has not even mentioned the impact of this proposed development on the local residents. There have been 381 objections to this development, including from our MP and local parish councils. I'm going to concentrate on just 3 areas. First, government policy and national and local planning framework on the protection of the rural area beyond the Green Belt. The NPPF, and I quote, expects local authorities to protect and enhance valued landscapes, recognise the character and beauty of the countryside and the benefits of the best, most versatile farmland in their policies and decisions. Your own policy, GBR2, states that the rural area beyond the Green Belt is a valued countryside resource, recognising that only exceptional developments may be permitted. There is nothing exceptional here except its huge scale and the level of devastation that it would cause to the countryside. Secondly, there is a statutory requirement to protect our best and most versatile land. This development on productive grade 2 and 3A land. Therese Coffey, Secretary of State for the Environment, recently addressed the House saying, "It is really important that we make the best use of our land to have food security. It is also important to consider the best place to put renewable energy. Let's put the best agricultural land for farming and make use of brownfield sites for a lot of these energy projects." Furthermore, the consultation published last month on the reforms to national planning policy recommends further increasing the protection that should be given to best and most versatile farmland in the NPPF. The policy is therefore both clear and strengthening. To destroy productive land, which is being actively farmed in the midst of a food crisis, must be wrong. Suggesting that this development is only temporary and that the land might revert to agricultural use in 40 years completely misses the point. Finally, national planning guidance confirms we should not prioritise solar farms. The government recent 10-point plan demotes solar below all other green energy types. The sustainable choice is for us to grow food locally and for this application to be refused. In conclusion, this proposed policy is contrary to government policies.
I think we're there, Mr. Horner. I know you were nearly there, but 3 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now we've got 2 speakers for, and they are Greg Hilton and Andrew Urquhart. And I believe that you will be sharing the time between you. That's right, isn't it, Peter? And you are? Yes, of course. Yeah, absolutely. But so you get 3 minutes between you. Yeah, which is not a lot. So do your best. And I'm assuming you've worked out how you're going to share your 3 minutes already. Yeah. Okay. So don't press the red button until you're ready to go. That's fine. That's fine.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. High energy prices are driving a cost of living crisis, and solar PV is the UK's cheapest source of electricity, according to UK government figures. We're in a climate emergency, and these proposals will increase zero carbon solar generation in East Hertfordshire by 86%. An ecological emergency has been declared, and these proposals will increase biodiversity by over 82% and is supported by Hertfordshire Ecology and Local Wildlife Trust. The application site is sandwiched between the new Little Haddon bypass and the existing National Grid overhead power lines, and is close to Bishop Stortford substation. Taking account of comments from parish councils, local residents, officers and schools, the scheme is now 40% smaller, removing all development from the Greenbelt. Our proposal will deliver low-cost electricity for 10,000 local homes on an annual basis, 2 kilometres of new hedgerows and permissive paths, and 10,000 new native trees, along with wildflower meadows, bird and bat boxes, whilst retaining all existing rights of way. A community fund will provide grants for local communities to install local solar PV and EV charging points. We note that 80% of the UK public have no problem with solar farms in their local area, according to the government's latest opinion poll in December 2022. Furthermore, only 5% of the landowner's holding will be used for the solar farm. There's no cumulative impact to be considered at this location. The site is not highly visible from longer distance views, and the site uses less than 0.2% of the district's best and most versatile farmland. Unless we tackle the climate crisis now, we will see a huge decline in the UK's homegrown food capacity. Renewables are essential to reduce the severity of climate change, including droughts like last summer, with the impacts of food production and farming. We've secured a local grid connection, and we urge members to grant consent in line with Ofwat's recommendation. Thank you.
So I'm speaking on behalf of the Bishop Stortford Climate Group. We're a group of local residents dedicated to action on climate change, and we support this application, as do many local people who recognise the urgent need for action in East Herts. Although we strongly support rooftop solar, progress is very slow. An equivalent 35 megawatt capacity would need panels on almost every house in Bishop Stortford. So getting the scale and speed of the development that we need is not realistic with rooftops alone. The area needed for this is only 0.3% of UK land area. So the fear of panels taking over the countryside is really not justified. But we are already losing crops to climate change, as we saw with last year's summer drought and heat. We're also facing a collapse in biodiversity, with insect populations crashing due to habitat loss and pesticides.
I'm very sorry to have to stop you, but it's the same rules for everybody. I'm
Fine.
sorry. Thank you very much indeed.
That's okay.
Thank you both. Thank you. Yep. Okay, we now have Lucy Limovitz, who is the Vice Chair of Albury Parish Council. And Lucy, unless I'm advised otherwise, you also get 3 minutes. So the rules are exactly the same. Don't press the red button until you're ready. But we will stop you at 3 if you're still going.
Whilst we fully echo the comments made by Tim Horner, I would like to call out 2 further areas that are of grave concern to Albury Parish Council. Firstly, the Parish Council and local community have been disappointed with the applicant's engagement. Despite claims to have fully engaged with the community, they simply have not. For example, the applicant attended Albury for a public consultation. The meeting was well attended by the local public, who were and still are unanimously against the proposal. The applicant failed to respond to several questions posed, and these remain unanswered. We are also deeply concerned that over 70% of the supporters counted merely answered the question, why do you support a solar farm near Bishop Stortford? This tick box exercise was sent to town residents. We are not aware of it being sent to any communities where the impact to local amenity would be understood. These cannot be deemed support for this application. It makes a mockery of the process, given there are over 380 well-considered objections. We are heartened by the Planning Officer's recommendation not to attach much meaning to these. However, we wanted to reiterate this point to the committee. Secondly, the protection of our rural community, the environment, and protecting our heritage assets. We were alarmed with the officer's recommendation given Uttlesford categorically refused the application. This application goes against accepted government policy and the council's very own district plan. It is a clear breach of policy GBR2 and VILL3, with Uppit being considered a Group 3 village. The development borders the Greenbelt and is on protected rural area beyond the Greenbelt. It would further blur the boundary between town and country, a concern of this very office when the Bishop Stortford North development was approved. The district plan clearly states any further development outside of the A120 would be considered uncontained growth. Surprisingly little weight seems to have been given to this in the report. More worryingly, the PC are not aware of a sequential analysis study being undertaken. It is expected with a development of this size. Such rules stipulate that it can only be given a go-ahead on BMV land if all other options have been exhausted. We do not believe they have in this case. Therefore, it is not appropriate to approve the application. We would also question some of the representations. For instance, it is referred that this is inaccessible and unfarmable land. The land is fully accessible from Bishop Stortford via a farm track that is clearly visible on Google Earth. It has suffered no accessibility impact from the A120 bypass, so this is simply not true and worryingly misleading. In closing, the need to protect our environment is a complex issue, and this application is at risk of greenwashing at the expense of all other reasoning. Government policy is deprioritising solar as its effectiveness is limited in our climate. National Grid statistics for 2022 confirm that wind provided 26.8% of our power, compared with only 4.4% from solar. Interestingly, less than 1% of the country's power came from solar in the last week, proof that it is not effective when we need power most. If approved, you would be going against the wishes of parish councils, the relevant communities, and huge numbers of the wider public. We urge East Herts Council to follow suit of our neighbouring district and dismiss this application.
Well done, Lucy Limovitz, to the second, almost precisely. Very good. Well done. Thank you. And we now have a further speaker. I think the last speaker we'll have this evening, and this is the local district council member, Councillor Jeffrey Williamson, who is going to come and speak. All the rules we're applying this evening are very standard rules that apply to every planning meeting. So the local district member is not time limited. Trickily, it falls to my discretion as to when we think he's spoken for an unreasonable length of time. But I appreciate you've got a lot to say, Judge. So away you go. Thank you.
Okay.
Sorry,
Thank you very much indeed,
Jeff,
Chair.
just hang on. Oh, okay, all right. You crack on.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed, Chairman, and good evening, members. Thank you for allowing me to address you this evening, which I'm doing on behalf of my local communities and the many residents who have contacted me with regards to this planning application. In response to this application and other emerging solar farm proposals in the area, the Campaign for the Protection of Rural England has put together this document, which puts the case against the placing of solar generation in greenfield locations quite comprehensively. I understand this has been circulated to members of the committee, and I hope you have taken the opportunity to read it through. Environmental sustainability is at the heart of everything that we do. Members will recognise that statement as being one of the Council's 4 main priorities within our current corporate plan, supporting the Council's environmental agenda. So, to reassure you, I am not here to argue against the need for renewable energy sources or undermine the Council's position on climate change initiatives. But what I do want to ask you to consider is how well the proposal in front of you fits in with the delivery of that priority. So if I may beg your indulgence, there are 8 distinct points I would like to draw members' attention to. My first point is the loss of high-grade agricultural land. The whole of this 59 hectare site is classified as best and most versatile agricultural land, i.e. is the best quality for growing of crops. In national planning policy terms, there is a presumption against any development of BMV land. In addition, events on the global stage make food security even more important, and priority should be given to retaining prime agricultural land. And as the point was made earlier, the 40-year temporary period rather misses the point when we need that food security now. It has been suggested that this land is no longer farmable. It is not clear why, in reality, this is the case. The land remains fully accessible from Bishop Stortford via farm track and has suffered no problems with accessibility from the building of the A120 bypass. My second point is on sequential testing. Many experts have argued that solar installations do not need to be built in the countryside, saying commercial roof space and brownfield sites are more appropriate. Thus, the CPRE have said that a sequential test on land availability should have been undertaken before this site was put forward, i.e. identifying the most suitable land before putting forward the least suitable. Appeal decisions on this point have set out clearly the process for seeking out more suitable alternatives. No sequential testing or alternative option appraisal, however, has been carried out in this case.
My third point relates to preservation of the countryside. The application has been amended to take out of the application site those areas which were to have been in greenbelt to overcome earlier objections. Even at its reduced size, the area containing the solar panels covers 46 hectares, which I calculate to be the equivalent of 72 Premier League-sized football pitches. The remaining area is classified as rural area beyond the greenbelt, which, as stated within our district plan policies, should be afforded much the same protections. The scheme is described as temporary in that it is intended the solar panels and associated plants will be removed after 40 years operation and the land returned to its current state. This period has been extended to 43 years to accommodate the usual 3-year period under which developments can be started, which takes us to the year 2066. The CPRE have commented that at that time, the land will be in no fit state after 40 plus years of permanent shadow, fixed rainwater runoff channels, embedded cabling and firm foundations to be able to revert to agriculture. Topsoil, if piled up for this time, loses its inherent qualities. Again, there is a relevant appeal decision when the inspector made it clear that not even the 21-year period could be considered to be just a temporary loss. In addition to the solar arrays, the scheme also includes for the associated battery containers, substations and other plant, covering a further 3.5 acres of open space. Much is made of the proposed mitigations to minimise the visual impact of the solar arrays through screen planting, but of course hedges and woodland take time to grow and establish, which means it could be 15 to 25 years or more before they really have any significant effect. In the meantime, the solar panels and the plants will remain visible across the landscape. Even if the screening should prove effective in obscuring the panels, this does not address the loss of open long-distance views across the landscape created by the new woodlands and hedging. My fourth point is the effect on wildlife and biodiversity. Despite the proposed mitigations to introduce more biodiversity to the site, there is still a negative impact on wildlife. I quote from the CPRE that birds can mistake the glass for water, causing injury or death, and the ground under the panels becomes degraded with little potential for biodiversity, as half of it will be in permanent shadow. The 12 hectares of hedgerow, woodland and wildflower planting make up 20% of the whole site, but this does not compensate for the other 80% which will become barren. This fencing is 2.5 meters high and described as deer-proof. You may be wondering if this is just to protect the site from the occasional buck or hind that may have inadvertently wandered that way. However, there is a well-known large herd of roe deer that traverse the area around the site, which will be displaced if their regular tracks are blocked. This could mean them diverting onto the Haddam or Stortford bypasses with potentially tragic consequences for deer or motorists. My fifth point is on more general impacts on the local area. It is noted in the report that there are a considerable number of heritage buildings close by, including Haddam Hall and Upwick Hall, some only 100 metres from the site boundary. The quality of their setting is an important aspect of the value of these historic assets. In addition, the site abuts right up to the boundaries of a number of residential properties. Furthermore, the site will sever the link between two important ancient woodlands, being Bloodhounds and Upwick Wood, and all the associated passage of animals and birds. These woodlands rely on connectivity. The Council's Conservation and Urban Design Advisor has commented that the open landscape of the area has been compromised by the building of the Little Haddam bypass. But this does not justify further devaluation of the area, which is still enjoyed by local communities. Some mention has been made within the points of objection to fire risk from the battery units. Fires of lithium-ion battery units produce toxic fumes and are notoriously difficult to extinguish. In another application locally for a battery facility in which Hertfordshire Fire and Rescue were consulted, they expressed concerns and recommended a range of conditions to minimise risks. It would seem that HFR have not been given the opportunity to comment with regard to this application, and therefore those same conditions to minimise risk have not been considered. Taking all this into account leads me to my sixth point, which is the comprehensive level of objection from the community, as you've already heard. As you will have seen, Based on all these factors, there has been a vehemently strong reaction from the local communities. There is now a total of 381 individual objections from residents, as well as letters of objection from Albury, Burden and Farnham parish councils. I hope the committee has recognised that whilst a number of people are recording as having registered their support, many of these are in fact only stating support for solar energy in principle, with many responding within a questionnaire, "Why do you support a solar farm near Bishop Stortford?" with no reference specific to this site. I therefore question the amount of weight that these can be afforded. This leads me to my 7th point, which is current government policy on solar farms as reflected in various recent ministerial statements and correspondence. Our own MP, Sir Oliver Heald, has objected specifically to this application and made his concerns known about other potential solar installations across the area, particularly where they are based on prime agricultural sites. Sir Oliver asked a question on the topic in the House at PMQs and received the confirmation from Dominic Raab that such developments should be targeted at brownfield and not at food-producing prime agricultural sites. And Robert Jenrick, then Secretary of State for Housing, Communities and Local Government, also confirmed in a letter to Sir Oliver that the NPPF expects local authorities to protect and enhance valued landscapes and sites of biodiversity and recognise the character and beauty of the countryside and the benefits of the best and most versatile farmland in their policies and decisions, and that a number of proposals for solar farms in the countryside have been rejected as causing harm. There has been a host of other statements made by ministers which put the need for agricultural land and protection of our countryside above the need for solar power, one of which we heard earlier. But for the sake of brevity, I won't cite them individually, but they are all publicly available, of course. And to point number 8, which is on points of policy. Tonight's report quotes various paragraphs from the NPPF, NPPG, and elsewhere, which covers developments for renewable energy. But these are points of basic principle and do not take into account the particular attributes of this site. In terms of our own local policies, we do not have anything that specifically covers solar farms in the rural area beyond the Greenbelt. So we are relying on a blend of policies to determine whether this proposal is acceptable. GBR2 lists the type of development that could be permitted, but these do not include renewable energy schemes on prime agricultural land. The fact that the policy is silent on this, as described in paragraph 8.19, does not mean that they are therefore automatically deemed permissible, as the report implies. Coming at it from the other end, policy CC3 does cover renewable energy generation, but states the council will attach particular importance to maintaining the special countryside character of the rural area, including the preservation of long-distance views from public rights of way. Therefore, I argue the two policies do not sit well together in the consideration of this case, and that the logic of this paragraph, which is key to the argument for approval of the scheme, is badly flawed. I would therefore ask that you do examine this closely in your considerations.
Jeff, can you wrap up now?
Okay, I'll just come to the summary then, thank you. So to summarise, I'm not arguing against the need for sustainable energy, far from it. What I am presenting is that this is the wrong proposal in the wrong place. Putting solar generation on prime agricultural land in our green rural area should be a case of last resort, not first resort, and based on the most compelling evidence through a sequential test. The application is contrary to national planning policy and to our own district plan policies GBR2, CC3, DES2, ED2 and VIL3. No sequential analysis has been undertaken and no account has been taken of determined appeal decisions in relation to other solar schemes. So refusal, not approval of this application, better promotes the council's environmental sustainability objectives by retaining higher quality countryside. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Williamson. Okay, so just where it goes for the benefit of the members of the public, we will now have comments and questions from members. Officers will respond to the various points made. Hopefully between myself and the Vice Chairman, Tony Stowe, and members, we will pick up all the points that have been made. and then eventually arrive at a decision. So I think let's start with members. So do I see Tim? You've got your hand, and anybody else at the moment? And Terence. So take Tim and Terence in that order. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. First of all, I'd like to correct a statement that it was a local member speaking. There's actually 2 wards, and there are 2 local members in the room tonight, one of which is myself. And I cannot come along to this committee meeting as a member of the Development Management Committee with my mind made up. Just I'd like to make that.
I think then we will note that in the minutes, Tim. Thank you very much.
Now, I have 2 or 3 questions to ask in a sort of normal way. First of all, officers have spoken about management of construction traffic. I'd be very interested to know how this is going to be managed, what a left in, left out traffic movement entails, where the traffic is going to join the A120, and how the banksmen will be used. I'd also like to ask about, to have confirmation that the location and setting and general embracing of historic heritage, whether there would be any detrimental effect. I'd also like to ask a question about the lead local flood authority, who have objected to the proposals in their letter to yourself. There was an objection. There was a grudging, in my interpretation, a grudging giving way to conditions being applied, but that wasn't to be seen as an approval of the flooding conditions. It was just an acknowledgement that that might be the best they could get out of it. So what I'd like to know from yourself on the local flooding situation is, are you prepared to take on board the conditions as stated by the lead local flood authority, which is Herts County Council? And also, Herts County Council said that these conditions have been, to paraphrase, drawn up and presented by the applicant. If that is the case, how will the applicant be monitored in ensuring that those conditions are applied? Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Tim. There was quite a lot there, so I think I'll leave officers to respond and I'll come back to you.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks for the questions. In reverse order, if I may. Yes, the lead local flood authority have not removed their objection, but they have recommended conditions which, if permission is granted, they would like to see attached. And yes, those are included in the recommendation. So that's condition 17, 18, and 19, and 20. And the reason for the difference of opinion is effectively around what it is reasonable to require predetermination and what it is reasonable to require by condition. Because this is an area where flood risk is overall low, especially in terms of the sensitivity of any receptors, there aren't many houses near to it which are likely to flood. We are satisfied that it's appropriate to use conditions to control some of these details. Effectively, the drainage or surface water implications of the scheme are relatively low, and so therefore we're happy to use conditions. In a very kind of short summary, The main matter which the lead local flood authority felt should be done now is infiltration testing as to how much water would infiltrate at what rate into the ground. But we're satisfied that that could be done by condition, as it is a site which currently drains. In terms of, are they conditions recommended by the applicants? The applicant tried to help the LLFA by drawing their attention to some conditions which were being used elsewhere. The LLFA then made up their own mind and advise us as to the conditions, and it's those conditions which are in the report. In terms of how they would be monitored in exactly the normal way, effectively the conditions require that details of the drainage are supplied to us before the development commences. They'll be submitted, we'll consult the lead local flood authority who will advise us whether or not it's good enough, and then we'll either approve it or not. And then in the normal way, we'll monitor to make sure that those are implemented. So hopefully that addresses that point. On the historic setting point, there are two elements of the heritage. Effectively, there's built heritage in terms of some listed buildings, and there's also archaeology and below ground heritage as well. Our conservation and urban design team have not objected to the proposal. Yes, they did comment on the fact that the bypass has had an impact on the character of the area, and that is a fact. It clearly has. However, they do not object to the proposal, and they feel that the impacts are acceptable. Hopefully that helps you with that. And then turning to construction, yes, the proposal would be left in and left out. A transport statement has been submitted which sets out details of how they envisage construction would occur, and condition 5 is for a construction management plan, so the full details of that. Once they know exactly how many lorries are going to be needed to deliver it and things like that, that'll form part of that discharge condition. So that's why we don't have that at the moment. Banksman would be used. Again, we don't have the details of where exactly they'd stand or what equipment they'd use. That would be at discharge condition stage. The visibility splays only require the clearance of some vegetation in order to be achieved, and so that can be done. And so through condition 5 and also condition 10, those details would be submitted. But effectively, County Highways have assessed their proposal. Their first proposal for a temporary site access they didn't find acceptable, but their amended proposal for a temporary site access, County Highways considered, and subject to those conditions, they find it acceptable.
Could I just ask this supplementary? Just whereabouts will this joining with the A120 take place?
Can you see the blue dotted line which comes from the south of the site and goes south? I'll point to it in a second. And then can you see the inset box as well? So that is the temporary access. So well, I'll point to it now and then I'll describe it.
Yeah, but the thing is, there's two parallel roads. If I'm thinking of the same place as you are thinking, there are two parallel roads. One quite elevated. How do you get into the inner of those two roads?
So at that, in the bottom right where it says in red site access, that is an existing access which will be used, and that is where you get in from the highway network, and then you drive along parallel to it, and then you go north.
So you turn left. You're coming from Little Haddam, and then you do a left turn.
Yeah, you're on the highway network, and then you turn left at that point, and then
Thank you.
Tim, you okay with, you feel your questions have been answered? Just making sure.
I may come back, Chairman.
Okay, that's absolutely fine. Terence Beckett.
Thank you, Chair. 3 points from me were questions. thanks to a recent television programme I watched on the excavation of the fields around the new leisure centre. East Harts and indeed Bishop Stortford is proven to be much more significant in terms of Roman activity than was previously thought. Is there any conditions around any archaeological digs before any development is done on the land? The second point I'd like to ask is against point 5.16, the crime prevention design advisor's comments regarding deer-proof fences and his recommendation for LPS 1175 certified fencing. And another product of the company I used to work for in certifying fences. That wasn't my job though. Obviously, deer-proof fencing to protect deer from running onto a road is one thing, but we've got a high value, dangerous site, which inevitably mischievous hands may want to try and get inside. Should that be upgraded as a condition to that fencing and also covered by CCTV? Because fencing, border protection is like a triangle, and on one end is detection, the other one is resistance, and the third one is response. So how long it takes the police to respond as a result of an alarm is how good that fence has to be. Otherwise, it's useless. So I think that should be upgraded because there's a health and safety issue, I think, there as well. People could be electrocuted, they could be stealing stuff. Just, you know, there's issues. And then also, if you are able to give us some information on how that decommission plan enforcement is triggered, because in 40 years' time, obviously, is someone just going to forget about it and it'll be left? It's just.
Thank you, Terence. Good points. Richard, Karen.
Thank you. Yeah, so archaeology first. Maybe I can point you to paragraph 8.29 effectively. So a desktop survey was undertaken by the applicant that was submitted as part of the proposal. We consulted the county's archaeology team and they are satisfied with it and they recommend conditions for further trench work to be done based on the results of that geophysical survey. So hopefully that addresses those concerns. Coming to crime prevention, yeah, those comments are in the report and there's consideration given to them as well. Just to clarify, the proposal does include CCTV, so there would be CCTV as part of the proposal. We are recommending a condition 22, about full and final details of security measures. And so we'd expect that to cover things like monitoring of CCTV, how alerts happen if anything happens. But I do want to say that there has to be a balance between preventing crime, which is a material consideration, and the safety elements of that, and other things such as ecology, biodiversity, and the impact on species. And so actually officers consider that this should be the type of fencing which is being proposed. Some crime could occur as a result of any development, or in fact not as a result of development as well. And so there's got to be a balancing act. If you entirely enclosed it in a solid fence, it would be safer, but it would obviously have a much greater landscape impact. And so that's a balance. And given the characteristics of the area and the rural nature of it, we think that this is the right balance, and that's the form of the recommendation to committee. On the decommissioning point of it, so the conditions 1, 2, and 3 effectively deal with decommissioning. I wasn't entirely clear on exactly what it was which you wanted. So effectively a decommissioning strategy needs to be prepared, submitted. That covers the details of how it'll be taken away and those side of things.
No, I'm just going to interject. You must put the question the way you choose to put it. But one of the things that occurs, I'm sure, to everyone in the room is probably none of us will be here in 40 years' time. I think this is what you're driving at, isn't it? So what is it in the system that in 39 years' time will make someone realise that something needs to be done?
This, if it's granted, is a temporary permission by virtue of the description of development and the fact that those conditions require require it to be taken away and categorically states that it needs to be taken away, it is a temporary development. It would be unlawful for it to be there for any longer than that. My only answer is just in the normal way that enforcement happens, where things are in breach, where conditions are in breach, enforcement action would be taken. I think it's fair to say this is relatively high profile. If it's approved and happens, it'll bed in and maybe that'll change over time, but it's not something which is hard to miss, if I can put it that way. So I'm not concerned that we would miss that trigger point.
And I was going to add, Chair, that we routinely enforce conditions. Some of them are more than 20, 25 years old. Some of them were secured in the 1980s, and we still look to take action if those conditions, if there's a breach.
This isn't meant to be a trivial comment, but do you in effect therefore have a way of diarising long-term time limits so that you know, dare I say it, your successors, when they join the district council, will be aware of them?
I think the short answer is no, we don't. But as Richard said, with something as large as this, you know, we would expect over the passage of time, this information wouldn't be lost forever. It's something we could give consideration to. But this type of condition has been imposed on a number of solar farms, other solar farm applications with similar durations. So it's not out of the ordinary.
Well, we need to move on with questions, but obviously, if you might just think about making some form of diary note, it's just for the benefit of the public here. I happen to be a solicitor. Solicitors make very long-term time limit entries in diaries these days. It is doable, so I think we'll leave that with you. Sorry, Sally Newton and then Rishi, and we'll take you after those two, Ben, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I apologise, my voice is not very good tonight, but my questions are very simple. They're just for clarification. In 2.4, somebody said, obviously in the presentation, no footpaths are lost, and yet there is some reference to bridle ways. I don't know whether you are considering them as all in one or whether bridle ways are and footpaths aren't. So I just want clarification on that one. I want clarification on the grade of land, because one gentleman here, when he was presenting, referred to grade 2 and 3A, and then when the district councillor spoke, he's referred to it grade I, which would really be grade 1. So I'd like clarification exactly what grade the land is. It's good that trees are being planted, and I noticed that they're being planted on the north side of the proposal, because there is some issue about shade on the panels, so there'll be a gap between any trees planted. So with regards to the hedges and the existing woodlands, will there be any trimming, or will the panels be built a sufficient distance from the hedges and the trees not to have shade impact on the panels? Moving on to 516, this fencing and deers. I had great concerns because poor deers, they have a tough time, and a lot of them, when the A10 went through, had a hard time. The fencing, is there a proposed gap from the ground to a certain point that will allow minimal transportation of wildlife, fox size or muntjac size or whatever is up there? I don't know, because without wildlife traversing, you've got a big problem. But really my main question is, I've got a dot saying sheep, but you can come back to me on that one. With the current evidence that is being gleaned from established farms, and there's one just up in Cambridgeshire that's vast, I'm assuming all the references to impact, birds, water, mistaking solar panels and insects and wildlife and everything, are all these statements from actual evidence of established farms that currently exist and the one up in Cambridgeshire that I remember seeing in in Newmarket must be in there at least 10 years already, or has the evidence about the concerns to the wildlife come from any other source? In other words, some of the advice is so conflicting, I'm not too sure. So if you could just clarify those for me, I'd be grateful.
Thank you, Sally. Rishi will take those before we come to you. There's getting quite a lot there for officers.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, and thank you, Councillor, for the question. So yes, bridleway for these purposes is one of the types of footway, so that is included in what we're talking about. So no loss of bridleways, no loss of footpaths, increase through the proposed permissive paths, and all the existing ones retained. Grading of agricultural land. Could we please go right towards the end? Yeah, that one. Yeah, thank you. So this is an agricultural land classification map. And what it is showing is that the blue is grade 2 and the green is 3A. So it runs from 1 to 5, and 1, 2 and 3A are the best and most versatile land. So all of the sites is that. So it is 2 and 3. Thank you. And then coming on to your next point about trimming, yes. The LEMP condition 7, I think from memory, requires details to be submitted of what the management would be, and that management needs to make sure that it's managed in a way which secures those biodiversity improvements, which are a very significant part of this, but also managed in a way which mean that the footpaths are clear and there wouldn't be significant overshadowing of the panels. If you can move back to the site plan, which was the one I was on previously. Yeah, no, back one. Yeah, thank you. Effectively, you can see through the yellow areas there. The yellow is the wildflower mixed planting that establishes those standoffs from the hedgerows, so that that would be minimal anyway. And also, whilst we're on this, hopefully this helps on the fencing point. I'm sorry, I meant to say it. I was reminded to say it and I forgot to say it. Deer-proof fencing is fencing which is tall, aims to prevent deer so they can't jump over it. We do want deer to be excluded from the areas where the solar panels are, because we don't want them to get caught in and amongst them. They will get stressed and get trapped in there. But it does have it's mesh, and so there are gaps, and so other mammals, invertebrates, smaller animals, etc., can pass through that. And the other part of that to say is the fencing isn't around the entire site. So there'd be the existing hedges upgraded with additional hedge planting to reinforce that. And then on the inside of those, effectively, that's where the fencing would be set off as well, with the planting as well. And then, with the wildflower planting and then the solar panels. Not aware of any sheep. But yes, thank you. Yeah, the point. Right, I'm not aware of any sheep in this part of Wickham Hall, or any intentions for them to be so. Obviously, farmer can move sheep onto the land without needing our permission. Just coming back to the impacts on birds and other animals. Yeah, I think it's really important that this is an evidence-based decision, effectively. A detailed ecology appraisal has been submitted with this. That's been followed up with an addendum following comments and following amendments to the scheme. That's been commented on by the experts, being the ecology team at the county and being the Wildlife Trust, and they recommend conditions. They are satisfied with the proposal. Various references being made to various groups and publicity which they provide, both in favour of this type of proposal and against this, and promoting different forms of renewable energy. Just to be clear to the committee, this isn't about demonstrating a need for renewable energy. Government guidance is that it should be accepted that it is accepted that there is a need, and it's not about one form of energy type being better necessarily than the other. The government's energy security strategy, which is a material consideration, is of relevance and is very briefly touched on there in the reports, talks about having a variety of sources of energy generation and a move towards localized energy generation, so that if something does happen with larger power stations, it has less of an impact because there are localized provisions, and so that needs to be taken into account. But effectively, in terms of the impact on wildlife and birds, the ecology teams have assessed this. Natural England have assessed it, and they're satisfied with the proposal. The Campaign for Protection of Rural England are a campaign with a certain position, whereas the recommendation which is in front of you is an assessment of various different viewpoints and various different policy requirements in the plan, taking all of those together and coming to the planning balance.
Okay, thank you, Sally, for that. Rishi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My first point is just coming back to condition 3, which was the removal of the equipment at the end of the temporary permissions. Now, there's a lot of detail going in about how the site should be developed and put in the first place. But in 40 years' time, 43 years' time, you know, what's stopping just cranes going in, lorries going in, pulling everything up and leaving the land in a state that isn't suitable then to be farmed and arable? You know, metal stakes in the ground after 40 years could be snapped off. Visible may look as if it's been cleared, and actually only if you actually then try to farm the land, you find issues. So is it not possible to have a condition specifying that the developers have to put in a plan specifying details of how they would remove and what conditions they would return it to, just to give greater security to that? And then the second point was just on the photo montages of the screening. I think it was the one showing the land at the north where it's close to residents' properties. Now, I understand, having visited the site as well, you know, the potential impacts and visibility from the bypass are more limited. However, it was noted that, you know, the solar panels are set back at least 5 meters away. That's still less distance than me to where officers are there. So it's not actually a significant amount of distance. And whilst motorway highway user driving down the bypass may only see a visible, you know, a passing glance of the site, 5 to 10 years for screening to take impact is actually quite a significant period of time for a resident that's their everyday view. So is that again something that could be looked at in terms of from day one, or at least shorter time period, something could be put in to mitigate those impacts? Thank you.
Thank you, Rishi. We'll take you, Councillor Crystal, now, if that's okay. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thanks for the report. It's very helpful. Yeah, a couple of kind of clarifications, please. Firstly, paragraph 9.4, it talks about the planting. So there's new trees and hedgerows going in, which is very positive, and that they will be retained at the end of the lifetime of the panels. So panels going 43 years. And what do we do to prevent the hedgerows being grubbed up and the trees cut down, and the biodiversity gain lost? So I'm just curious if we can. And this is, I think you've probably said a number of times, but I just want to be absolutely clear. Conditions 3 and 4 will return the site to its current designation in planning terms. I just want to be absolutely clear on that, so you can confirm that. I think, and we've heard from various speakers that there have been statements by ministers and the suggestions in the consultation for the NPPF changes coming up. Are they material considerations here? That's my question.
Thank you very much indeed, Ben. I'm going to take one more question now because I think we can. I'll take you, Ruth, now. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, first of all, I want to thank the supplementary papers we got this evening, because that actually answered my question on 7.7e about why we got a 30-year work schedule when it's going to be there for 43 years. So thank you very much for that. Couple of queries really. The first one is about the public rights of way. Are they going to stay open during construction? Because obviously if the construction traffic is going to be using some of that for access, will they be available for the residents, for people to be able to use and access? And I know on condition 3 about the soil, no, sorry, condition 4 about the soil quality, restoration of the soil quality. Again, how can we actually, ensure that that will stay the same after the time?
Thank you very much, members. Okay, officers. Yeah, Richard or Karen, as you choose.
Thank you again. Decommissioning and the details of it and making sure people don't just come along and rip it all up and off we go. Yes, absolutely. Condition 4 is aimed at that, and so that answers a number of questions. Actually, it requires either 12 months before the 43-year date or when the scheme ceases to generate electricity, details of a decommissioning scheme to be submitted effectively. So that makes sure that it happens in a sensible, manageable way. That's about the impact on biodiversity. That's about an impact in terms of highway safety, highways and safety as well. And then part C of that deals with soil quality. And so this point about best and most versatile land and soil quality is a really fundamental one. Inherently, by virtue of not being used for agriculture, it does give an opportunity for the soil to recharge. Although it's not as simple as that, because obviously there would be some overshadowing of that and some differential drainage. However, Natural England have advised that it's acceptable to them and that the soil is likely to be of the same quality. And on that basis that it is of the same quality, they don't have any objections to the proposal. And condition 4 requires details to be submitted. So if it requires that soil is improved in any way, it would be in part C of condition 4, which would cover those issues. Coming back to the point about councillor about the impact on local residents and the views for them and the distance, if we could actually if we can move to the site plan, please. Is that all right? Proposed site plan. Next one. Yeah. Excuse me. So the nearest residential property is that grey blob right in the north of the site. Thank you. Yeah, so that's the nearest residential property. That's the nearest noise sensitive receptor, and so it is further away. That's the nearest residential. That's the nearest residential property. It's further away than some of the other views which you're saying. I can measure it and come back to what that distance is. You don't have a right to a view in planning terms. It's not a material consideration. The views which we've been sharing you have been about the impact on the landscape character and how that may or may not change and the acceptability of that, and that is. But what you look at out of your window and that being aesthetically beautiful isn't a material consideration, because different people might like to look at different things. However, it is a good distance away from it, and what's being proposed actually at the north is a woodland planting block. So there would be between that property, between the red line boundary nearest that property and the solar panels, there'd be woodland planting, and so that's effectively what would be looked out on. It's also probably worth pointing out that there is some existing mature vegetation along that boundary anyway, and so I don't feel that people would be looking directly out on the solar panels. Coming to some of the other points, so public rights of way. I don't actually know the answer to your question. I don't believe that there is any intention to close any, but in any case, if there is a separate legal process to go through. You need to apply to the county to divert or or temporarily make unavailable a right of way, and generally you have to provide a replacement. So hopefully that's covered that issue.
Richard, can I just come in on that?
Yeah,
If it were to be the view of this committee that permission will be granted, and we haven't got to that yet, is it possible to deliver a message to county that we would expect the public rights of way to be maintained for public usage?
I think that's a statutory requirement on them anyway, and it's not something we could secure reasonably through this planning consent.
All right, so we can express a view, but okay, this one.
This image actually shows the rights of way. So the existing rights of way in green and proposed in blue, proposed additional in blue. So the construction access would be along an existing right of way for a lot of it. And yeah, in the comments from County Highway, they have requested, part of the reason why they've requested details of that is about pedestrian safety. It is about making sure that people can still walk along in a safe fashion, that section of the right of way at the southern end of the site whilst construction's ongoing. So yes, I think it's relatively fair to say the vast majority of the public right of way network would be available during it. Yeah, apart from that access and running along the side of the site, and the Hertfordshire Way running along the other side, the only other area where there's a right of way which actually runs through the site is that green north-south section, which maybe can be indicated at the northern end, northeastern end. So really, it's only that section in the site where there could be a more significant impact whilst the panels are installed. But these do come modularized, prefabricated, and are installed on site, and so that would hopefully be relatively minimal. I will pass over to Karen on the point about material considerations in general, but written ministerial statements are generally taken to be material considerations, but we need to be aware of the hierarchy of policies and guidance, and effectively you must determine applications in accordance with the development plan unless there are material considerations which indicate otherwise. A written ministerial statement or the MPPF or the planning practice guidance or a site-specific circumstance could be a material consideration to go away from the development plan, but you need to be clear on what that is. And those are not as important taken individually as adopted policies, and draft and emerging positions are not to be given the same weight as formally adopted and established policies or guidance.
I mean, all I was going to add in addition to what Richard's just said is that if anything, planning policy is moving towards further support for renewable technology, and there is a consultation paper out at the moment. And the government has been very clear that two of the main priorities are improving the environment, but also tackling climate change. And it sets out a series of principles around that. And one of them is that planning decisions and the policies that support them should enable renewable and low carbon technology. So it is, if anything, it's strengthening in that regard rather than going the other way at the moment. That's what's being indicated in the latest draft MPPF.
I'm just going to ask you not necessarily to expand on that, but I'm just going to come back on that slightly because a number of speakers have talked about policies in various different ways. There have been references to statements by ministers, I think statements in the House, references to East Hert's policies, lack of policies. I'm wondering, Karen, if you could take this moment to bring all that together and effectively guide the committee as to whether or not, in terms of policy, the recommendation that the officers have made for this application is or is not appropriate.
I think it's important that you look at the development plan as a whole, and that includes the MPPF and includes our district plan. And when we arrive at decisions, and this isn't a straightforward decision. This is an unbalanced decision, and I think we've not shied away from that in the officers' report. And I think we've tried to set out as clearly as we can in the officer's report what weight we've given to certain aspects of the proposals and the policy weight that we've attributed to the impacts of the development versus the benefits of the development. And I think that's clearly set out in the report. And, you know, members do have to make a difficult decision tonight. You know, that we haven't shied away from the fact that there will be some adverse impact or visual impact on the landscape. But we have also set out the planning balance of that versus the biodiversity net gain advantages, which are significant in this instance. And obviously, you know, the clear benefits of you know, establishing some renewable energy production in East Herts, which, you know, in terms of that versus fossil fuels, I mean, it's clearly a better form of energy source. So, you know, all of that has to be weighed in the planning balance. And we think with the appropriate mitigation, which Richard has set out, and the fact that this is a temporary consent, and we are confident that at the end of the lifespan of these solar panels, that you know, the fields can revert to agricultural use, and there are conditions that require that, the appropriate recommendation in this instance is approval.
Thank you very much, Karen. Now I've got Peter Ruffles and Tony Stowe in that order.
Jim, the last batch of questions have really mopped up most of the things that were in my mind, but there are two fairly small details that I would just like to re-examine again, because we've touched on them once a little bit earlier, and that's the biodiversity botanical between the rows of solar panels. And I just wonder, and it links up with the other question which Councillor Williamson seemed to be at loggerheads really with our officers on the nature of the soil at the end of this period. And I just wonder who we're relying on. And I think Richard, the officer, did describe where his sources of information came from about it being all right after 40 years. But my knowledge of farming, such as it is, it's more limited than some others here, is that a fallow year, as it were, would happen 1 year in 5 or 1 year in 7. And in that fallow year, crops would be planted which would particularly reinvigorate and reintroduce the legumes, for example, clover, into the soil. So I'm wondering how much control we've got over this diversity wildflower scattering of seed, the nature of the species, and particularly, and it may be in the condition which is being re-examined, particularly whether there's a management regime required, because managing biodiverse crops, plants, is much more complicated than the simple crop of the farmer, as it were. And so I just wonder what controls there are there. But there was the business that Councillor Williamson referred to in quite some detail about the damage which is done to the soil by runoff and other features. So just could we re-examine that?
Thank you very much, Peter. And Tony?
Yeah, thanks for that. A couple of points I want to clarify, really. The first one been raised a number of times now about these footpaths. Now, I believe I heard you say that the blue footpaths are permissive footpaths. And if that's the case, the landowner can withdraw those at any time. So I think we ought to make that clear, they're not permanent. That's one point. And the other point, going back to the life of this 43 years, in my experience, applications that have had lesser time than that, I can bring one to mind, which is 3 years. It took people on the ground, members on the ground, to actually point out that these are overdone by 6 months or more. So I'm not very comfortable about the 40 years. Yes, we'll get to it, it will be picked up. I want to know what system we can put in place to make sure it would be picked up. Thanks.
Sorry, thank you very much, Tony. Richard, do you want to take a stab at those? If I might say, it's particularly important that you respond to Peter Ruffles' points, because all credit to Peter, he's picking up Councillor Williams' points, and we must respond to those.
Yeah, thank you. I'll start with those. Effectively, you were asking about, well, as I understand it, you're asking 2 points about, firstly, what's planted between and underneath the panels, and the extent to which that, in the traditional way, allows the soil quality to improve. I don't have experience of farming, but it is but it's not the case that it's proposed that it would be a crop which would do that in the traditional fashion. As he said, legumes and things like that can do that. It isn't proposed that there would be planting between the panels which forms a crop, or which does that. It would be a grassland mix which supports and encourages biodiversity. So there'd be some flowering elements to it, there would be different species in it, and so that the function of that would be improving biodiversity. Now there's a condition to secure the details of that, and when we put the slide on the screen earlier showing the planting, and I said we'd want the details of exactly what species are to be planted, so that is controllable, but I would caution the committee against requiring something to be planted which needs to be harvested or whatever, because as you said, councillor, that is something which requires a whole different approach to it, a different maintenance regime, etc. And the intention and the way that this has been assessed is that is about biodiversity enhancement. It's not that that planting would improve the soil.
Chairman, can I just come back to say, still a management regime, whatever is there, I think needs to be part of a condition somehow. I mean, mowing a particular point of the year may work depending on what plants actually are introduced.
Yeah, absolutely, completely agree. So the condition 7 requires details of that, and we would need details to be supplied of exactly what those exactly how that is going to be maintained. So yes, we would want that, because we wouldn't want it to get overgrown, etc. It's also not in the applicant's interest that happens anyway, and so they would want to do that. Moving, you brought in the point about the impact on the soil and to what extent it gets disrupted. I don't really have that much to add to what I've already said. Effectively, the proposal, well, to quote Natural England's comments back, if I can just bring those up, they state that, this isn't a quote, but in broad terms, they are satisfied with the proposal, and that is because this doesn't lead to a significant loss of best and most versatile agricultural land as a resource for future generations. That's because the solar panels will be secured to the ground by steel piles with limited soil disturbance, could be removed in the future with no permanent loss of agricultural land quality likely to occur. And then they go on to, as long as the soil is appropriately managed and the development is undertaken to high standards. So they are satisfied that it can be done. Details would be secured by condition around how that happens at the end of the line.
And then I think you need to, Richard, I think you need to respond to Tony Stowe's point.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, sorry, the difficult questions. No, yeah, on permissive paths, they are permissive paths, and that can be withdrawn. It's my understanding, but maybe my colleagues can come in if not, that you're making a decision on an application in front of you, and that includes a package of measures to mitigate some harm. And one of those, which officers are giving weight to in their recommendation to you, is that there's those permissive paths made available. If that is a significant part of the consideration and part of the way in which you as a committee come to decide that it's acceptable, I would have thought that it's appropriate that there is a condition requiring those to be kept publicly available, subject to emergency situations and things like that, for the lifetime of the development. And then on the 40-year point, as Karen said, maybe that's something which we can take away and give some thought to how we will record that and make sure that it happens. Just as a general point, East Herts thankfully has a very well motivated and engaged and informed group of residents generally who often tell us about enforcement issues and when things are carried out not in accordance with planning permission or with or their breaches of planning controls. This has clearly been of interest to the local community. I am sure that the local community in 43 years time would be very vocal if it got to a point where there was a breach of that condition. However, I do accept the point that we do need to find a way of appropriately recording it.
Thank you, Richard. I've got Ian Kemp, and just so I know, you want to come back, Rishi, after Ian? That's fine. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a couple of quick points and one longer one. The quick points build on questions that have already been asked. I support Councillor Fernando's point that is the proposed condition 4 sufficient in that it only requires a remediation plan to be done at the very end of the whole process. I would feel more comfortable if there was at least some sort of outline remediation plan actually at the moment, and that could perhaps go into either condition 4 or condition 7. It would seem logical that there was firm evidence as to how this land could be returned, or at least some reasonable ideas as to how it could be returned to reasonable soil quality and agricultural use. I'd also like to take a point made by Councillor Crystal. I think it's already been, but I'd just like it absolutely clear that the area will continue to be considered as a greenfield site. There is no danger of it being considered as a brownfield site after 40 years for development purposes, so it cannot be used for housing or something like that. Third point made by Councillor Beckett, referring to the crime aspects. There are numerous solar farms around the country. Is there any evidence that people have broken in, damaged them, vandalized them? If not, I would be inclined to, well, I would, in any case, I would feel strongly inclined to stay with the existing plans for deer-proof fences, and because they would be much less visually intrusive than the sort of much more robust fencing that seemed to be being asked for crime prevention. A linked thing also is to whether any survey has been done of deer routes across this site and whether anything can be done to establish that. The larger point, I think, thank you to Karen Page for acknowledging that this committee has a very, very difficult task before it. We're being asked to weigh conflicting evidence, put weight on different aspects. We're being asked to weigh the climate crisis, the climate emergency, for which we've passed motions supporting everything we can to do something about it, against the food crisis and the need for food. We've got conflicting information or conflicting views, from example, Natural England and CPRE, who are both in the same sort of area. So I think we as a committee are being asked to weigh these conflicting aspects, and it's very important that we see exactly what those weights should be, and it helps us to form our decision. And to me, it seems fairly key as to the question of the gain from renewable energy against the loss of agricultural land, both of which have been emphasised quite strongly. There's also the loss of views and things, and personally I particularly welcome the withdrawal of the Greenbelt land from the scheme, because there were some attractive views down there which it would have been very sad to lose adjacent to public rights of way. So I'm very pleased to see that that has gone.
In terms of the statistics, it's been suggested that 35 megawatts would be generated by this solar farm, and that's enough to provide the energy for 10,000 houses. Question is this a 35 megawatts a maximum figure, or is it something that would be fairly common? Do we have any idea as to what the actual load factor would be? I've seen figures suggested in the figure of maybe 10 to 15% over the period, so that would reduce it significantly. Set against that is the loss of the agricultural land, and the overall scheme appears to be about 60 hectares. And it's been suggested very reasonably that we should look to put things on brownfield sites instead, or on less valuable agricultural land. This council over the last few years has been struggling to provide land for any sorts of projects like housing projects, and had to take a substantial amount of land out of the green belt in order to actually meet housing targets. It uses brownfield sites whenever it can, but they are few and far between. And again, there are other competing uses for them. So in terms of the agricultural land, I focus particularly on 8.18 in the briefing documents, which says that East Herts has approximately 34,000 hectares of agricultural land, all of which is grade 2 and 3A. So it seems to me that there isn't actually an easy alternative in terms of us saying we could put it somewhere else, because there isn't any low-grade agricultural land around, and there isn't any brownfield land around. And the other question, I think, is 60 hectares compared to 34,000, or to the 1150 hectares of Wickham Hall. It does not seem to be a very great proportion, whereas saying that it provides energy for 10,000 homes, or even 10% of that if the load factor is low, seems to me to be quite a substantial contribution to renewable energy. Yes, we definitely want to get solar panels onto roofs and things, and East Herts District Council recently ran a scheme for doing that. And I'm sure quite a few of us participated in that and got quotes back. And I think many of us were perhaps surprised at the cost of putting panels on our roofs and of the payback time involved, and the infrastructure required when you've got scattered things. And unfortunately, it is the case that economies of scale often make a difference. So I just wanted to double check that the figures that I've quoted are accurate, and that I haven't misinterpreted any of them, because it does seem to me to be a material consideration in working out what weight we place on renewable energy against food production and agricultural land.
Rishi, you had your hand up, but I think I'll take you now if that's okay, and then we'll see what officers have to say. Thank you.
Mine will be short, given that Councillor Kemp raised most of the points I was going to. The only other one that I had was, it was brought up by speakers as well, given the lithium batteries, well, the battery storage on the site, and it was mentioned that other battery farm applications similar had the fire service consulted on it. Was that a statutory requirement, or even if not, would it not have been wise to have consulted with the fire service, given that it is a rural location and these things, whilst rare, if they do catch fire, are inherently difficult to put out?
Thank you, Rishi. I'm just going to look around the room again. So, Ben, you want to come back one more time? I think we'll try and take that now, please.
Thank you. Very quick one. I don't think I had an answer to the, you may have done, to the query about maintaining the planting beyond the lifetime of the project.
Okay, Richard, Karen, ready?
Maybe we can start there. Yes, apologies, I missed that one. There are no proposals to require any maintenance of that planting beyond the lifetime of the development. So the conditions are all about that planting being maintained during the lifetime of it. So yeah, technically, yes, they wouldn't have tree protection orders on them. They're not in a conservation area. There are some protections for hedgerows, and you need permissions for those to be removed. But yes, ultimately, those trees could be felled at the end in 43 years' time. I suppose the only other thing to say to that is there's a lot of existing woodland both on the site and in the surrounding area where that hasn't happened to it. And so there's nothing to suggest necessarily that it would happen. As always, we assess trees as to their suitability for protection if we feel that there's development pressure on them, and that might happen, and that hasn't happened at the moment. So we do not feel that that's the case, but we do have a procedure in place where we feel that there are good quality specimens which may come under pressure for those to be assessed in that matter. But to be clear, no, there's no conditions requiring them to be maintained beyond the 43 years. And I would advise that those would not meet the test of conditions. You couldn't really do it. And then dealing with the battery storage, the Fire and Rescue Service are not a statutory consultee on this proposal. They commented on a commercial battery farm, which would only be a battery farm and which would be operating at a much higher voltage. And so there would be more batteries in a shorter area, in a smaller area at a higher voltage. And so that's why they commented on it effectively. They haven't commented on this proposal. There is no statutory requirement for them to comment. The battery storage is in the shipping containers towards the middle of the site. Yes, there is a fire risk associated with those, I think it's fair to say. I imagine it is in the applicant's interest that they have various fire control mechanisms, but it isn't something which we're recommending a condition on, and generally fire safety falls outside of the planning control system. So we don't feel that that's necessary. And coming back to Councillor Kemp's comments, yes, that's one of the key balancing acts. And those areas and those proportions are correct. All of the agricultural land in East Herts is 2 and 3A. Of course, you can look beyond the boundary of East Herts. There's no intrinsic reason why this needs to be within the East Herts area, and so that must be considered. But this proposal is 5% of Wickham Hall's holding, and I've done the maths. It's in paragraph 8.18, as you say, but the agricultural land in East Herts is 34,000 hectares. And as you say, this is 60 hectares. That's about 0.18% of East Herts agricultural land. Coming to the status of the land after the development, may I be clear, yes, this would not be brownfield land. This is a proposal to temporarily, for 43 years, put solar panels on it and then remove them. At that point, the only lawful use is the existing lawful use as agricultural land. Any assessment as to what happens after that in terms of other uses would be made then, or when a planning application is submitted in accordance with the policies in accordance at that time. This sounds slightly disingenuous to have started mentioning this now, but there is actually an outline decommissioning strategy which has formed part of the submission, and that does include details of how the decommissioning would be approached. It approaches it from a financial perspective to make sure that it can actually be funded and happen, but it also sets out principles which are about making sure that it happens in a safe fashion, making sure that it happens in a way which doesn't negatively impact on public rights of way, members of the public, biodiversity, and the soil itself. But ultimately, yes, condition 4 requires the full details of that. How these things happen maybe can entirely different in 40 years' time, and so it's appropriate that that's done further on in the process and not at this point. It is worth pointing out as well that outline decommissioning strategy also includes a commitment to investigating the recycling and the reuse of the panels as well. And then finally, hopefully, there have not been any surveys of deer routes as far as I'm aware. As I say, an ecology strategy and ecological assessment has been submitted and considered acceptable. deer do use open spaces, don't they, as well as areas where there's more cover. They would be excluded from these fields by virtue of the fences, but maybe the areas, the site areas which we were talking about earlier, talks to how significant that is. Deer are not an endangered species. They are common, and so officers feel that the weight should be given to their protection versus the other matters. It's set out in the report, but is relatively low.
Thank you very much, Richard, and previously Karen. Just pick up the ones that you just feel have been missed, Ian, of yours.
Okay, the proportion, do we have any ideas on the proportion of that 35 megawatts that would actually be available in general? And Councillor Beckett's question about, well, is there any evidence from other solar farms around the country of vandalism or other aspects?
Yeah, apologies for not answering either. And the answer to both of them is no stroke, I don't know. I am not aware of any evidence around vandalism or danger or crime as a result of these things. And the submitted information says that the capacity of the panels is about 35. So I'm assuming that is a maximum, but I do not know the answer to that question, if I'm completely honest, Chair, Councillor.
Okay, this is my final look into the chamber. I've got Sally and Terence in that order.
It's just nitpicking because I like accuracy. The reason I asked about the grade of land is that there are substantial number of farms that have grade 1, which is the top. There's one just north of where it's going to be developed. So when you say it's 2 and 3 as being the top grades, well, not exactly. However, they are significant. I do not know of any other grades below 1, 2, and 3. So what are the other grades that you would be referring to if you say that 1, 2, and 3 are the best? I'm just curious because I didn't quite understand that.
And Terence will take you as well now, please.
It was just a bit of a comeback on Councillor. Oh, I've got my glasses off on there. Councillor Kemp's question. I had read an article this afternoon. Wellington in Somerset, 6 weeks preceding the end of April, there was 17 attacks in a small village of solar farms where cabling and equipment was stolen. And evidence of people making several attempts to go and have a look and do more than one trip, depending on what they wanted to flog at the scrap merchants that week or whatever. And that's just obviously just one village in one area.
Okay, so I'm going to take that as the final comments from the floor. I've got 1 or 2 comments to make in a minute, but I'll let Richard and Karen deal with these final points from the floor first, please.
Maybe just on that final point, I'm not in the slightest disagreeing with what you say, Councillor, but I have no information for the committee as to the veracity of that or how many solar farms there are in the country and whether or not that's proportionate or representative. I think the consideration and assessment of the application should be based on what's in the report and the statutory consultee's input. But also there is a condition around the full details of the security and safety of it recommended, and that would do that. And then, like we said earlier, it is a balancing act between various different things. Agricultural land gradings go down to grade 5, and Karen will come in on that in a moment. I'm not aware that there is grade 1 land in the district, if I'm honest. I believe that all of the land is 2 and 3A. But it is all best and most versatile. I may be wrong, but I'll hand over to Karen maybe on the classifications.
Yeah, I mean, I can't confirm if there's any grade 1 agricultural land, but as Richard said, there are 5 grades. Grade 3 is good to moderate quality land, and then it sort of diminishes from there to grade 4, which is poor quality, and grade 5, which is very poor. So, and there's characteristics within that that sort of establish which grade the agricultural land is. But as Richard said, East Herts, and as stated in the report, is all grade 2 and 3A. So good quality and very good quality agricultural land. Does that answer your question?
I think that's all the questions from the floor, and we're clearly moving towards the point where we make a decision. I just wanted to go back to one or two of the points made by the speakers at the beginning of this meeting that I'm not sure have been responded to. Councillor Limovitz made a couple of comments, and it seems to me the issue here is firstly whether they're fair comments or not, but more importantly whether they bear on the decision that we're being asked to make. So she was concerned that the applicant had not very well engaged with the local communities, and she also thought there were inaccuracies somewhere along the line in the way this matter has been presented to the local communities and indeed people at large. And she also made another point which I noted as that other options have not been exhausted, and I'm taking that to be the same point that Councillor Williamson made in respect of sequential testing. And I think members would like to know what your comments are on those points made by the speakers. And then once we've heard your comments on that, if there are no more, well, depending on whether there are comments from the floor, I think we'll move to the decision.
Yeah, so thank you. On the engagement point, firstly, there is no statutory requirement for a developer or an applicant to carry out any engagement exercise at all. The statutory requirements on the local planning authority to do that, and it's set out in statute what we need to require. I can confirm that has been done. I would say planning isn't a referendum, and the number of representations for or against isn't in itself the number a material consideration for exactly some of the reasons which have been set out in this committee. Who actually knows who some of the people are who've commented and where they are is more about the comments made and this the extent to which they are accurate and material considerations. So yes, it's not about whether or not there's more for or against. All the representations have been summarised in the report and hopefully have been addressed. On the exhausting of other options.
Yeah, there's no requirement in planning policy, either at national or local level, for sequential testing to be undertaken for these types of developments. There are for certain other types of development, but not in the case of solar farms. So it's not a requirement of the developer to demonstrate that there are more suitable sites in other parts of the district. We as local planning authority are required to assess what's in front of us and the planning merits of what's in front of us.
Okay, thank you very much. That last point obviously is quite an important point. We have an experienced committee here. We're all very familiar with that, but it's an important point, well made. Okay, so I think we are now moving towards making a decision. So with that in mind, can I just make sure that all members are aware of the back page of the late representations? Because the back page of the late reps include some suggested revised or additional condition wordings. And as we move to the decision here, the recommendation in front of us is to approve. So I think the importance of these points on the back page of the late reps is that if we approve, we will be approving on the basis that these revised amended conditions will be part of the approval that we're giving. I got just one more point for officers, but it's not a new point, you'll be pleased to know. And that's obviously there's been quite a lot of attention given to the 40-year issue and the extent to which that will get picked up, given that maybe at least some of us won't be around in 40 years' time. I am going to suggest that, with all due respect, although I'm sure the local communities will be very, very attentive to this, it's not really sufficient that we just make that assumption. I can't see any reason why we can't set up some diary system, annual five yearly reminders to whoever is the senior planning officer at the time. And I would like to suggest that should be added as a further condition. I'm looking at the room. I've got nods. We're content that that's probably sensible. Are we? Okay, so on that basis, then the recommendation in front of us is to approve. I'm sorry, does somebody wish? Sorry, Karen, I didn't see you.
Sorry,
Please comment. Yes,
our
okay.
legal officer has just made a point about the permissive paths and the
Yes.
condition we discussed earlier, and whether we could secure it by condition. And we would like to take that away, because permissive paths are at the discretion of the landowner, and we want to make sure that we can secure it legally. We can secure that, and if we can, we will.
Okay, I'm just going to talk that back to you. I think everybody in the room understands that we don't control permissive paths by definition, but what you're saying is that we will look at it, and if we think we can do something, we will.
Yeah.
And I'm take it that the idea is that there'll be some form of consultation with the chairman and the vice chairman of this committee as to the precise wording that you come up with, if you feel able to come up with a wording at all.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, so that conversation we've just had in relation to the permissive paths point goes into the decision that we're making. I take it everybody's happy with that. Looking for nods. Okay, right. So the application in front of us, which is recommended for approval, is application 321-2601 FUL, and it relates to the erection of a solar photovoltaic farm with an output capacity not to exceed 49.9 megawatts of energy, with supporting infrastructure and battery storage, inverters and transformers, fencing and landscaping works. It's located at Wickham Hall Estate, Haddon Road, Bishop Stortford. I think I need a proposer. Yes, I need a proposer. Ian Kemp is proposing. Do I have a seconder? Ben Crystal is seconding. All those in favour, please show a hand. 12, okay. Anyone against? Show a hand, please. And I don't think that leaves an abstention, but just for completeness. No? Okay. In that case, the decision of this committee is to grant permission application 321-2601 FUL, which means that we have approved the application for the erection of a solar photovoltaic farm with an output capacity not to exceed 49.9 megawatts of energy, with supporting infrastructure and battery storage, inverters and transformers, fencing and landscaping works at Wickham Hall Estate, Haddon Road, Bishop Stortford. Thank you all very much indeed. Thank you. Yeah. There's there's nothing to agree now, David, actually. So let's just finish. No, indeed. Let's just finish the agenda. So thank you all very much, members, for contributions to that debate. I thought excellent contributions, and I dare say the public are disappointed with the decision, but I'd be very disappointed if they didn't feel that we had a proper debate about it. So thank you all very much indeed. So item 6 is items for reporting and noting. David, this does neither require an agreement nor a disagreement. And then that brings you to item 7, which is urgent business. And that also doesn't require an agreement or a disagreement. So with that, at 9:26, the meeting's finished. And thank you again very much indeed, everyone.